We ended yesterday's broadcast with a brief mention of something that's going to come up more and more, so we figure we may as well stay ahead of the curve before it even becomes that month, let alone time of year, because let's be honest, the commercials aren't waiting for us. The topic of Halloween is always a controversial one among Christian circles, and the question itself was very aptly worded. Is Halloween satanic? And obviously, there are two parts to that question. Is Halloween satanic, but also is anything satanic? How do we know the difference and what to avoid and why? So starting off with the fundamentals, we want to give you a brief historical overview of the traditions surrounding Halloween as it's practiced today. That'll hopefully give all of you listening a more informed perspective compared to the hype that internet Karens are giving it right now. So, starting off with some of the accusations, I'm sure you have all heard at one time or another that Halloween is taken from the ancient pagan festival known as Samhain. It's spelt Samhain, but it's pronounced Samhain because the Celts don't like to follow rules. And what's interesting as well is that they would claim this is a festival celebrating the dead, that the Druids, the oak seers literally, that would host these pagan festivals as their priests would dress up in animal skins or as monsters and so forth and try to ward off evil spirits. And then it centers around this whole idea that we adapted it into our culture, I guess, here in America, and that if we want to be Christians, we want to be salt and light, we should avoid pagan festivals. What's a little closer to the truth is it's also associated with Dios de los Muertos. Now, Adrian, you come from a Hispanic background. Could you translate that?
Day of the Dead.
All right, so that celebration, that festival remembering the dead, and that's essentially what it's all about. But what people tend to forget, firstly, about Norse pagan history, as well as pagan history in general, but also of that history, church history, and what founded those sort of deals is that they don't actually say how they're described online. Now, of course, we are also online, and it would be fully ironic for me to say online. Don't hear everything you see online. Look this stuff up and verify it. We want to make sure that you're as informed in your own mind as well as from us. Don't trust us because we're saying it. Trust us because the information actually backs up with the facts. When it talks about the Day of the Dead, it was a Hispanic and also a European iteration of a series, believe it or not, of holidays that were actually moved because of popular vote, and none of them had any association with paganism whatsoever. When the celebration of martyrs, those had given their lives for the faith throughout history, a day of remembrance was set aside for them on the western side of Europe, and southwestern as well, around May 13th. Concerning the Day of Martyrs. And that was pretty much the case until, as Christianity permeated the Roman Empire, Germanic and Celtic countries, that is more northwestern sections of Europe, were also getting in on the celebration. And since winters there are a lot more harsh, they wanted to include every excuse to celebrate these things, and instead of a pagan association, it was actually a Catholic tradition. They wanted to celebrate it on November 1st, and Pope Gregory III officially set that as the rule and standard. Now, again, it varies. In Ireland, it was April 20th. In most sections of the early Roman Empire, it was May 13th. In Germanic countries, it was November 1st. But all of these festivals were, again, not in any way associated with Samhain. It was a remembrance of those not who had died, but given their lives specifically. Now, obviously, there's
it was really just a demarcation of changing of seasons.
Yeah, and that's all that we know about Samhain.
And there was a spiritual thinking behind it, but it wasn't like what we think of, All Witches' Day or whatever they also called it.
Yeah, I'll get more into the pagan aspect here in a minute. But when we're talking about the Roman Catholic tradition, understand that's the foundation of all of this. They had a martyr day. But note, there's three kinds of people in the world. People who give their lives to the faith, people who just lose their lives with faith, and people who lose their lives without faith. And so they decided to expand on this a little bit. There was, of course, November 2nd. It also went as far as November 6th, but it depended on what day of the year. That's Dios de los Muertos has a different iteration every year. But also note the souls that had died not as martyrs or had been canonized as saints according to the Roman Catholic tradition, but those who had just died, people who were in purgatory as they understood it, would be celebrated on November 2nd. And then you have to ask, well, what about those who aren't in the category of believers or all condemned day, if you want to refer to it as that? And that is when October 31st came into the mix. Now, obviously, in a remembrance of the dead, Catholics are going to be Catholics, Romans are going to be Romans. They're going to do what they were going to do. Note that none of this yet has any association with paganism. It is simply a remembrance of those who have physically died in any category, and they're taking these days to remember them. The reason it was introduced at the turn of the seasons was convenience, because a lot of the Christians at the time of the Middle Ages were, of course, in more Germanic countries, not in the countries that were celebrating it closer to Easter, or Pascha, as they called it, Passover. It was simply for convenience sake. We have no documentation that, in order to accommodate the pagans, the Jesuits introduced this idea. Nothing could be further from the truth. We need actual documentation, and this is what we have. But building on that point, we look at Halloween today, and we see practices that don't involve a lot of remembrance of the dead. In fact, that's hardly the thing that's on anyone's mind when it comes to Halloween today. So where did the dressing up and where did the giving of candy come from, as well as the underlying tone of TPing your neighbor's house if they don't give you good treats or something, you know? Not speaking from experience at all.
Pumpkin smashing. And
yeah, that whole idea. Well, obviously, there's the association with the turnips, but that is jumping the gun a little bit. We're asking, what about the actual practices that are foundational here? And the closer we get to Halloween, we'll repeat this point, go into more details about certain things and less about others. But here's the point. The practices have two main historical events associated with them. We've talked about All Saints' Day as far as the date on the calendar. It would fit in that general time frame. But what about the dressing up? Well, that actually was the English's fault. And I know that today the English people have our sympathies upon the glorification of Queen Elizabeth, but, well, let the joke still hang in the air for that to be enjoyed. The British essentially had a failed attempt at their parliament being burned to the ground by a man by the name of Guy Fawkes. And Guy Fawkes, he was generally associated with the modern-day film V for Vendetta. The main hero is a vague word, but the mask that the main character, played by Hugo Weaving, is wearing is the Guy Fawkes mask. And the slogan that is associated with him is remember the 5th of November. That was Guy Fawkes Day. And so in the week leading up to it, including but not limited to October 31st, remember, November 5th as the objective. People would pull pranks, vandalize houses, and kids would wear his mask in honoring and remembering this Catholic revolutionary, if you were a part of that group. When people in England came over to the New World in the United States, what was becoming the United States, they brought their traditions with them. Now, masks, I can note the association, and the pranks I can associate, but we're not quite there yet as far as explaining the whole story. Because note as well, just like the Hispanic community brought over a lot of the facets, not only from their indigenous culture, but also from Spain, as far as the remembrance of All Saints' Day and the Day of the Dead in general, the remembrance of the dead in France, in particular, would celebrate this day by specifically dressing up in your Sunday's best. And obviously, you look back at the way they dressed up back then, it would seem like they're wearing a weird costume compared to our fashion standards now. I don't know whether that's a plus or a minus. I'll let you be the judge. But the point being made is this. The French immigrants, when they began intermarrying with the locals in the United States, as it was going to be called, they also, again, brought their traditions with them. So with England and France bringing not only their political feuds, but their cultural customs, Catholic in origin, to the country, there was a lot of interesting things happening in the week leading into November. So what ultimately did this amount to? Well, you've got a lot of kids, specifically British kids, that are going around vandalizing things and wearing weird masks. You've got a bunch of French people going around wearing their costumes in remembrance of their ancestors. And, as always, in the United States, what is our first and most prominent thought? How do we make money?
Commercialize it.
Yeah, how do we market this?
We could sell those masks, make money.
And what was also interesting is that people who generally don't like having their houses vandalized would resort to bribery. They would say, hey, kids, I'll give you a treat if you don't mess with my house.
That's why it was called trick, meaning I'm going to do something to your house or your lawn, or treat. Which do you prefer?
And note historically, when was the first time in all of documented history that the term trick or treat was first mentioned? It wasn't in Britain. It wasn't in France. It wasn't in anyone's underpants. It was in the United States in 1920. Very recent history. I know we're talking about...
If you don't give me a bag of candy, I'm going to smash your mailbox.
And that was the whole point. So when we're talking about this issue, these traditions have definitely developed over time, but I'd
like to see that tradition come back, though, just kind of force parents to get involved in, giving more candy out, because in the homes these days, it's pretty low, small pickings nowadays. Half the streets are dark and no one's there.
Well, I can't actually speak for myself. My roommate and I don't tend to be in the house during those days. But that even aside, there is still an incentive, because you know the rule. If someone leaves out a bowl that only takes one, you don't just take all the candy in the bowl. You take the bowl. You even should take the note to show it to your friends and saying, isn't that sweet? But I'm kidding. We're not encouraging that kind of behavior out front. But the point being made is just that when these pranksters would go around, these traditions were being upheld, people would host parties, they'd have costume contests, they'd want the kids to be busy on that night, because that was the start of the leading up to Guy Fawkes Day shenanigans. When this ultimately became nuanced in its history, the irrelevant details as far as how was now replaced by the what and why. What we're doing, well, that's obvious. Why we're doing it, kind of lost track. And as always, nature abhors a vacuum. Plenty of people will try to stir up false passion in those areas of ignorance. That's not what we want for all of you. But taking a step back and asking, but isn't there some pagan aspect? You mentioned the Druids dressing up like animals. You mentioned them having this festival for the dead. Well, again, as Adrian mentioned earlier, we don't have any record of Samhain having anything to do with the dead. It was definitely a superstitious time in the onset of winter. Yeah. But here's what we actually know. I'm going to recite it all from memory about the Druids in their customs, their practices, and what they actually taught. Are you ready? I'm done. We don't know anything, because the only mention of the Druids as oak seers was because they were hunted down and exterminated during Caesar's Gallic Wars. And what's interesting about this as well is that as far as Norse paganism is concerned, a ministry I'm trying to engage more in because it's coming back recently, is, interestingly enough, non-existent as far as the oral traditions are concerned. They didn't write anything as far as their history, as far as their religion, as far as their culture, even their alphabet is concerned, until a man by the name of Snorri Sturluson, who was a Christian, not a pagan, decided to write down his culture from Iceland. And note, this was exchanging after many hands, originating what they believe, according to some of the sagas, in Germany, Germania as it was called then, all the way into Iceland in the 11th century AD. Wow. So we know, as far as history is concerned, next to nothing about the Druids. And once again, people will bank on ignorance. We don't want that to be said of you. So when it comes to Guy Fawkes Day, when it comes to the celebration of the Day of the Dead, that's a conglomeration of Catholic traditions, not pagan ones. The moving of the date to the start of November was not for pagan reasons. It was because of popularity reasons.
Well, it was a response to whatever they did understand that time of year as a pagan time, not a day, but a pagan time of year. It was a response to it by trying to use it as an opportunity to evangelize the community. So it was the Christian early church's way of taking All Saints Day, moving it to November 1st, and then calling the day before All Hallows Eve, Halloween. It was a direct response or an attempt to say, hey, this is the perfect time of year to go out, as people are celebrating various reasons, to go out and evangelize them and tell them why we don't have to fear death or be depressed by the fact that seasons change, and this is sort of a time of death. We're recognizing that death is real and death is part of nature, and we have overcome death in Christ.
Yeah, so note these points. When we're talking about more information as opposed to less, that's where you want to come to conclusions off of. If we know less information, like with the Druids, like with ancient pagan customs, especially of the Celtic and Germanic variety, we know nothing. We're Sergeant Schultz in this matter, for those of you who know the reference. But the point being made is just that. If we're talking to people about what we actually know something about, we're going to be in a better place than if we're told something by people that don't know what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. Look this information up. I hope not to be the former category in all of your minds, but make sure that you always find yourself in the latter, that when we're talking about and when we're making decisions about things, it comes back to what we actually know. Now, this again, and as far as the execution is concerned, and then I'll hand it off to you, Adrian, about the issue of, so should Christians celebrate All Hallows Eve, as is, I guess, expressed today? And the answer to that is it's up to you personally, because in the book of Romans chapter 14, there's an interesting observation that Paul makes, and again, this was concerning an ancient controversy. In the early church, people thought they were more holy because they honored certain festivals in the Jewish religion. That's like OTOG, right? The biblical stuff. And whether they honored Sabbaths or not. And what's interesting about this is that when he keeps in mind the mindset of, well, I obey Jewish customs or I don't, what makes me more or less right with God? And he says this in verse 5. Again, Romans 14 and verse 5. One person esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. Let each be convinced in his own mind. Verse 6. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord, and he who does not observe the day, to the Lord he does not observe it. He who eats, eats to the Lord. He who gives and gives God thanks. He who does not eat to the Lord, he does not eat and gives God thanks. Note the common feature. God should be the focus. If you can, on All Hallows Eve, think about your relationship with God and redeem it, not as the day the devil has co-opted, but the day the Lord has made, then how you choose to rejoice and be glad in it, as the hymn goes, is going to be honored. If, on the other hand, you let the world set the tone for you and say, oh, it's all evil and pagan and satanic and so forth, utter nonsense when it actually comes to the information, but let's actually get down to the crux of the matter, pun intended. If you want to celebrate Halloween, you have that liberty. Just make sure you do so with God as the focus. If you don't choose to celebrate Halloween, you're not sinning. Understand that you should make that just as much God the focus. Don't denigrate a day above another. Elevate them or keep them all worth rejoicing for the same reason, that God's made it, and then you have the opportunity to be thankful. But let's get down to the actual issue. What would make anything satanic?
Well, it seems to me that anything that aids in the blinding of the non-believer, or blinding the believer to fall into sin or to fall away from the faith. So if 2 Corinthians tells us that the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers, and that anything that has to do with the activity of Satan is to point to Antichrist, meaning to dissuade people away from the genuine Christ, is satanic. So any film that celebrates atheistic thinking or atheistic philosophy would be a satanic film. Any film that would take us away from the fundamentals of Christian purity or Christian living would be in and of itself a form of satanic thinking. Anything that would create in us the opposite of the mind of Christ would be satanic.
So, false
and
doctrine.
That would be how I would, any kind of false teaching or any kind of heretical undermining of the fundamentals of the Orthodox Christian faith.
And again,
I should say Christian orthodoxy.
Yeah, you're not making this up on the authority of your own opinion. If we go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, there's an interesting, overview that Paul gives us of the end times, but describing the working of Satan. Notice how it's described. This is 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 9. The coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan. Okay, what's that? With all power, signs, and lying wonders, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this reason, notice the allowance of these satanic powers, God will send them a strong delusion that they should believe the girl floating on the bed and vomiting pea soup.
Oh, gosh.
No, the lie. That's what makes something satanic, that they may be condemned who do not believe the truth and had pleasure in unrighteousness. Just like all of the stigma around Halloween is either based on a lack of information or deliberate misinformation. I know we hear that word a lot, but this is actually a case of that. We need to be careful because that's actually the satanic element, to get our eyes off of Jesus and onto the enemy, or onto anything else, just not Jesus. We counter false doctrine, as 2 Corinthians 10 says, by taking every thought captive and bringing it into obedience to Christ. Make sure that's your goal. Okay, people are taking it this way. A, that's not historically accurate. B, that's weird since Catholics came up with this. And B, or C rather, 3, take your pick. It all comes down to my attitude, my perception, how this is helping or harming my relationship with the Lord. There are things that by nature you should avoid. Candy and costumes aren't two of them. Yeah. Maybe candy in some situations, but let's just make sure that we're being sensible about this.
And remember, as Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2, I think around verse 25 here, I would encourage you to read this, because from verse 22 to the end of the chapter, it's really, really, really helpful, like, encouragement. But verse 25, opponents must be gently instructed in the hope that God will grant them repentance, leading them to a knowledge of the truth, and that they will come to their senses and escape from the trap of the devil who has taken them captive to do his will. So the idea again here being that if something's genuinely satanic, it's really just people being led astray from the truth. When it comes to the Halloween issue, there probably is some caution. I mean, if you're like I was raised, speaking of the movie reference you made was a movie called The Exorcist.
The original one, not the original one, remakes or parodies.
My parents took me to see that apparently my mom said in theaters, and I was just a few or so years, maybe 5 years. I don't know what year it actually came out, but I was a child. And I've seen, my son's 2.5, and if something scary appears on a screen, he has nightmares. So I can't imagine how seeing The Exorcist at older than him damaged me. My father was a horror film fanatic, so I saw, if you were to list the top scariest, and most of you may not even know these, but if you were raised in a non-Christian home like I was, if you were to list the top 10 scariest movies ever of all time, I probably saw all of them before I was 10 years old. So when we would go to the movie store, the video store, we always were trained to just go straight to the horror film and pick something scary looking out, and that's how messed up we were. I think one of my first Halloween costumes was being Freddy Krueger, where I duct taped steak knives to a garden glove and ran around with a sweater and a goofy hat and oatmeal glued to my face.
That's healthy.
So I would say that there is probably a warning in that our culture does seem to use Halloween as a time to celebrate death, and I don't mean death as in a remembrance like Dia de los Muertos, but celebrate evil, murder, slashing. And I'm not even talking about just the paranormal side of things, of beliefs in ghosts and witchcraft and demons and so on. I mean just the celebration of blood and gore and murder. So that's where parents have to be wise and say, we don't want to glorify these things, and we certainly don't want to look at these issues with any kind of, it's not a big deal, it's just knives and blood and gore. So there is a caution, and I can't really add anything to what you've shared, but I would say that let's use Halloween for its intended purposes. Why the church did what it did, why they responded to the people around them when they did, and how that has evolved to our modern day. Why not just use it as exactly as it was intended? Let's use it as a time to talk to our friends and family about the reality of death and decay, and the reality of God stepping into human history, and redeeming us from death and decay. And secondly, let's celebrate All Hallows Eve, like the way it was meant to, by celebrating All Saints Day. Let's remember the saints who have given their lives for the gospel. Let's look at their lives. Let's look at how they lived and what they thought and what transformed them to take the gospel to the very ends of the earth by giving their lives to do that. Let's take that time to do that. Let's think about our ancestors who, if you came from a Christian family and you have ministers in your history, to remember who they were and remember what they did. Use it as an intentional holiday to remember the saints who have died for the faith, or who have just passed on and were of the faith. And then the last thing is use the time to read a good book. Talk about, speaking of our Christian faith, why not take your family aside and read a book like Pilgrim's Progress or
Fox's Book of Martyrs,
the Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, or whatever you want to make it. It's okay to take the time and celebrate it, and use it as a time to proclaim the gospel to your friends, your family, those in your sphere of influence. And it's okay to dress up and maybe have some fun with that. I would just say be careful not to glorify gore, because I grew up in that world, and I enjoy scary movies because it's almost nostalgic. Looking back of how terrified I was of the dark, there was several years where I could not sleep with the light off because of that emotional and mental abuse. But now I kind of look at it as kind of silly, and I don't enjoy like the violent type things. But when Hollywood tries to tell us what the afterlife or what the spiritual world might look like, it's just kind of like entertaining to giggle at it. But that would be my only caution, is to if you are going to be one of those parents who says, we don't have a problem celebrating Halloween, we want to be able to take our kids out trick-or-treating, define what it is, use it as an opportunity to educate your children about the truth of the gospel. What is the meaning of death? Why is death in the world? Why is it real? And that skeletons are, that's a human being who has passed away. It's just the reality of life. And then use it as a time to remember the saints who have just done amazing things in human history, even in our recent history, as Americans and as Westerners.
Why wait till November 1st if you want to elevate that day as your reading day, or every day alike? And again, you'll see me. Halloween will be a Monday this year. I'll be dressing up during the program like I did last time in my Hashira outfit. I'll bring my katana if you want to see it, and we'll have a fun time. But it's not going to mean anything because I'm literally just putting on a wig and wearing a haori. But if, on the other hand, someone's probably going to also be joining us, Pastor Scott, he won't be dressing up, probably not just because he doesn't see it as worth the effort, but because he's just not that into it. That's allowed.
He should dress up like one of those real spooky priests with the black hat, the traditional priestly suit.
Here's a suggestion to the elder if he's listening. You got a request, but
I'll be doing. I perform every year for a local someone who likes to throw Halloween parties. They love Halloween, but I'll be at Jim Click's house. I'm there every year doing magic for his guests and stuff, so it's kind of fun.
If you have questions about that, let us know. But let us know if that also is clear about All Hallows Eve. And feel free to reiterate for more details as the time dawns upon us.